Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see you. My name's Jeremy, and I've been leading these Monday night sessions this month. This is number 5. And we have a new presenter next month, shiny new presenter, Cynthia, who will be talking about dealing with anger, practice of patience, which is a juicy topic. So what we've been looking at this month is this idea that our minds are affected by misconceptions, and how these misconceptions give rise to various what we call afflictive emotions, and afflictive emotions that disturbing our mind. So I've been encouraging you to investigate what's happening in your mind, and I think it's very interesting when you engage in this practice of introspection, looking at your mind, see what's going on, and in particular looking at the ways that our minds get deceived by these misconceptions. And it can be very, I think, liberating when you notice that your mind is being deceived in this way, and by seeing that, then you can begin to address that misconception, understanding how it's wrong, and then focusing on the correct. So tonight we'll be focusing on the idea of impermanence, which is a good example of a misconception when we grasp at things being permanent or unchanging, when in fact they are impermanent and changing. So we'll do a meditation on that. So as we've been doing before, we'll start with a breath meditation, and the purpose of that is to focus your mind, just to focus your mind on one neutral object, so an object that doesn't generate attachment or aversion. And as I've said a few times, the meaning of meditation, the definition is to familiarize your mind with a mental object which brings peace, which calms your mind, and which is also aligned with reality, as in making your way of thinking more realistic as opposed to less realistic. So that's what meditation is. So firstly, just sit in a posture which you find helpful, conducive to meditation. So the main thing that we're trying to cultivate with meditation is alertness, as in being alert to what's going on in your mind. So sleepiness can be a problem. So to avoid sleepiness, it's helpful to have your back straight. And distraction is another thing that we find disturbs our meditation. So having your eyes closed mostly helps to reduce distraction, but having some light coming in also stops sleepiness. So you can see from the recommended posture that we're trying to strike a balance between sleepiness and distraction, also known as laxity and excitement. So then think about your body. How's your body feeling? Just relax your body. So it's also important to be comfortable. So if sitting on the floor is not comfortable, it's fine to sit in a chair. You don't have to have your legs crossed. So it's important to be comfortable. And then spend a moment thinking about your motivation. Ask yourself, why am I doing this practice? What is my motivation? What am I hoping to achieve? So we try to make our motivation as sort of vast and powerful as we can, which means thinking I'm not just trying to benefit myself, but I'm also trying to benefit others, be beneficial to others, helpful to others, to as many other beings as possible, humans and animals. So by learning to calm my mind and learning to reduce these afflictive states of mind, then I become more useful, not just to myself, but to all the people around me in my life that I interact with, and at the very least, not being harmful to them. So that's the motivation. And then with this motivation, you bring your attention to your breathing. Just focus on your breath moving in and out. So you can focus just on the point under the tip of your nose, on the sensation of the breath moving in and out past that point. So the two main mental faculties or tools that we use when developing concentration are firstly mindfulness, which means remembering the chosen object. So in this case, it's the breath. So remembering that the mind, remembering to keep the mind focused on the breath. And also introspection, which means observing the mind to check whether it's wandered off or whether it's remained on the object. And as soon as it starts to wander, to bring it back to the chosen object, which is the breath. So just try to use those two faculties, mindfulness and introspection, to keep your mind focused just on your breath. If you like, you can count your breaths to keep track. So breathing in and out would be one breath. Just keep counting. And if you lose track, then start counting again. So keeping your mind focused on the object doesn't require a lot of force. It's more like just resting your mind on it, but does require alertness to make sure it stays there and doesn't wander. So now that we have developed some degree of concentration, we can use that concentration to do analytical meditation. So that means investigating a particular topic. So we'll be investigating the topic of impermanence. So in this context, impermanence means momentary. It doesn't mean lasting. It means changing from moment to moment. So momentary means something that's changing from moment to moment. So it's not remaining unchanging or static for even a moment. So that's the idea of impermanence here. So you think firstly about your body. So, for example, the systems that operate in your body, the various physical systems, like the respiratory system. So that's processing around 550 litres of oxygen per day. And the cardiovascular system, which is moving at around 216 kilometres per hour. So you've got all this blood whizzing around your body. And the digestive system, which processes around 2 kilograms of food per day. So the body is a collection of all these different systems that are all performing their different tasks, purposes, and constantly moving, not static, changing moment by moment. And then you think of all the structures in the body, so all the various organs. We have around 78 organs in our body, all busy performing their various functions. So the heart beats around 100,000 times per day and pumps around 7,000 litres per day. So you think of all the various organs in your body, constantly moving, performing their function. And then all the muscles, around 600 muscles in the body, the skin, the bones, 206 bones in an adult. So even the bones are not permanent, they're changing moment by moment on the micro level. So you get this sense of the body being a collection of constantly moving parts, structures. Which is quite different to how we normally think of our body, I think. And then the microstructures that make up the body, so we have around 100 trillion cells. And then within those are the nucleus, within those the chromosomes, within those the DNA and the molecules, We notice the atoms. Within those, the protons that are moving around 400 kilometers per second. And then we even have these things called quarks, which are moving through our body at the speed of light. So right down to the atomic level, everything is moving in a state of flux, not stopping still for even a moment. So there's nothing at all you can find in the body you can point to and say this is permanent, this is unchanging. Is there? You can ask yourself that question. And then you turn your attention to your mind and do the same analysis of the different aspects of your mind. For example, the sensory perceptions, so seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting. So all these sense perceptions arise and then dissipate depending on sensual stimuli, like tasting food, hearing sounds. So all of these are impermanent, constantly changing. And the various feelings, such as pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, neutral feelings, the reactions we have to various things in our life, constantly changing, not lasting, not static. And all the emotions we feel, happiness and sadness, anger, love, contentment, frustration, etc. All these are arising and dissipating. They stay for a while, but even while they're staying, they're in a process of changing. So all these things in the mind are also in a state of flux. And then the same analysis we apply to external objects, things outside body and mind, such as other people. So other people are in the same way as us, completely impermanent, changing from moment to moment in their body and their mind. Same with animals, other living organisms, plants, microorganisms, so all constantly changing. All the physical objects in the world, the things that we possess, the things that we don't possess, attractive objects, unattractive objects. So everything in our environment is constantly changing, even mountains, planets. So at the end of this analysis, we get this feeling of everything being in a state of flux. Everything in our mind, in our body, everything around us, all the people around us. So this is the understanding of impermanence. And we can just focus on that feeling as our object of meditation, that feeling that everything in our mind and body and outside of our mind and body is in a constant state of flux, changing, not static. So just focus on that feeling, that conclusion of your analysis for a moment. So this is the process of aligning your thinking with reality. So you're trying to familiarize your mind with the reality of impermanence. So again, you use mindfulness and introspection to focus your mind on that conclusion of that analysis. Thank you. Then when you're ready, just relax your concentration. Okay, so how did you go with that meditation? Any comments or questions or? All right. Because you feel like everything's moving, it makes you feel like. Right. Right. And so what about when you reach the conclusion that everything is impermanent? Are you sort of able to focus just on that feeling? Yeah. Yeah. And do you find that kind of a nice feeling or a sort of like disturbing feeling? Right. Yeah, some people say they find that a bit disturbing, that feeling like everything is moving. Yeah. It reminds me of a funny story I heard of a physics professor, and apparently when he goes into the lab, he used to put snowshoes on because he had this feeling that he's going to fall through the bottom of the universe when he starts thinking about other. So that feeling like there's nothing here that's solid, everything's moving, even the ground, body, mind. But you have to say it's a realistic way of thinking, wouldn't you? I mean, you can disagree. Whereas we tend to think of things being unchanging, which when we analyse is not really realistic. Yeah. Yeah. Do you agree that everything is impermanent? That's a philosophical debate. In Buddhist view, there are some things that are unchanging, but they're sort of quite subtle and abstract things that we probably don't need to worry about. But like in Buddhist view, space is said to be unchanging, as in lack of obstruction. So this space here that allows me to wave my hand through it is said to be permanent from Buddhist point of view, like it doesn't change from moment to moment. So that's something to think about. There are a few other things as well. Okay. So I think that's a good example of, it sort of illustrates the fact that that there's often a discrepancy between the way things appear to us in an unanalyzed way, and then when we analyze things we can see that they're actually sort of quite different. And an idea like permanence, grasping at permanence, is one of these misconceptions which is said to be a cause for these various afflictive states of mind. So how does that work? So for example, with attachment, which we were talking about I think last week or the week before, Attachment is defined as this view that exaggerates the good qualities of an object, person or thing, and so it's exaggerating the good qualities and then projecting the good qualities onto that object as though they exist from the side of the object, and then seeking to try and obtain those good qualities by owning the object or consuming the object. That's the idea of attachment. So attachment is said to arise based on an assumption of there being some kind of unchanging essence in the thing. So that's an interesting idea. You think of something you're attached to, like a person, or even food that you might have strong craving for, or possessions, or it could be anything. So the question is, do you impute some kind of permanent, unchanging essence onto that thing? That's a question. So the Buddha is saying that we are doing that we're imputing some kind of permanence onto that, some kind of unchanging essence. And also onto the idea of ourself is another good example. So I remember saying this in a meditation class, that we have this idea of a permanent self. And someone objected, said, no, I don't think of myself as permanent, I can see that I'm changing all the time. Which is true, we can see that we are changing, but I think we also, underlying that, we have this idea of this sort of essential I or me, which has remained, that remains unchanged. So a good example of that, I think, is when you think of something terrible you did, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, and you go, oh my God, that's so bad. And then you're feeling this sort of remorse or guilt or embarrassment. And there's a feeling that person is the same one that did that thing back, in your school days or whatever, or, when you're a kid or whatever. And there's some kind of unchanging essence that you're imputing on me. So that sort of touches on the Buddhist idea of selflessness. So the idea that we have this view of this self as being some kind of essential or inherent entity, and so meditating on the impermanence of the self, of the I, undermines that feeling. So that's an interesting idea. So once when I was talking about this at a class like this, someone asked me, so what, if everything is changing from moment to moment and nothing stays still, what is it that takes rebirth? Buddhists have this idea of rebirth that passes from one life to the next. So that's an interesting question. I mean, whether you believe in rebirth or not, but even you could say, what is it that's passing from one moment to the next? So the Buddhist idea is that even what's passing from one life to the next is also impermanent. So there's no sort of permanent essence which is moving from one life to the next. It's still an impermanent sort of collection of body and mind, or mind in the process of rebirth. It's just the mind. So just to recap some of the points that we've covered this month, briefly. So firstly, this idea that all beings, sentient beings, which means beings with minds, have this limitless potential. So that's one of sort of Buddhist, main Buddhist tenet, and I think shared by some other spiritual traditions, that we have this sort of limitless potential to develop particularly our mind, so we can develop our compassion and wisdom almost limitlessly. And that's done through the practice of meditation, which, as I said, just means familiarizing your mind with a positive thought. So the idea is that through familiarizing your mind with compassion, for example, it becomes stronger and stronger in your mind and more sort of arises more easily and has the effect of reducing, the opposite thoughts such as aggression or wishing to harm. So we have this limitless potential, and that's, again, I say that's something you could feel free to disagree with. It's an assertion by the Buddha, and he always said, feel free to disagree with me. If you want to argue the other way, that's fine, that we are somehow limited in some way. But let's say you accept that idea, to some extent at least, and then the next point is that we have these afflictive states of mind which are sort of holding us back. So the afflicted states of mind, as I said, are the ones that are bothering us, the ones that are disturbing our mind, causing us to feel unhappy, like stress, like agitation, like depression, like anxiety, aggression. We can all think of that. Probably something that's bothering us the most. For some people it's attachment, some people it's aggression, some people it's anxiety. So these are the afflictive states of mind. So they're afflicted in the sense that they cause us to suffer, but also because they cause us to perform what are called negative actions, which mostly means harmful actions, harming people, harming ourselves. And then in the Buddhist idea of karma, that creates karma, which means that the action is creating a result down the track, which a negative action creates a negative result. So that's also a problem with these afflicted mental states. So they're holding us back and also causing us to suffer and also causing us to harm the people around us, even people that we love. So it would be nice to get rid of them. We would be happier and we would be more peaceful and we would be nicer to live with. And also we can develop our, spiritual qualities like love and compassion and concentration. So that's the idea. And then, as I explained before, this idea that these afflictive mental states are arising based on misconceptions, on misunderstandings of how things exist. So this is an interesting idea. So a good example of what is grasping at permanence. Or, as I was saying before, with attachment, we're exaggerating good qualities of something and then projecting those good qualities onto that object as though they existed from the side of the object. So they're examples of misconceptions, of deceptive appearances, and they're giving rise to these afflictive emotions. So attachment, as we know, when we have strong attachment for something, if we can't get that thing, we feel frustrated. Or even if we get that thing, the object, the person, whatever it is, that sometimes is disappointing because it doesn't deliver on its promises of what we thought it was going to be. Or if we're still very attached to it, we might feel anxious that we're going to lose it. It might, that we're going to lose the person or lose the object. So we're anxious about that. And if someone threatens to take that away from us, then anger arises. So attachment gives rise to anger. And also attachment serves as a cause for anxiety, because if you're very attached to something being a certain way, then you're constantly anxious about it either losing it or it changing. And because we don't have, control over that object, complete control, that having that strong attachment to that object is putting us in an anxious situation where we're trying to control something that's uncontrollable. So you think of someone, a relationship with two people, and one person very attached to the other person, really wants to hang on to them, but actually they don't have a lot of control. That person could, leave them at any time, or that person could die, or, so they're in this situation of anxiety. You can see how that's an anxious situation. We're trying to hold on to something that is by nature impermanent and also uncontrollable. So the problems with attachment. And so these misconceptions that I'm talking about, like attachment, like grasping at permanence, and there's sort of layers of them. I would say some are more obvious than others. So I think attachment and aversion probably more obvious. We can recognize those operating in our life. And then something like grasping at, or last week we were talking about this idea of holding yourself to be the most important thing in your universe, which you call, self-centered attitude. So that is a misconception in, firstly, as I was saying last week, it's irrational because, the I, this one person here, is just one, whether all others are, countless. So obviously it's, from that point of view, it's more rational to be concerned about all others rather than just this one person. So it appears to be entirely rational, but actually it's not. And also this idea that the view of holding myself as the most important thing is serving to bring me happiness as a self-protection, self-preservation approach is also not bringing. It brings a lot of problems. So it's not particularly successful as an approach. In fact, creates a lot of problems. So I was thinking a good example of that is, I think, by focusing very strongly on this I, it reminds me of the analogy of the story of the princess and the pea. You know that story? So the princess who slept on 100 mattresses, and there was one pea at the bottom of the mattress, and she was being tested to see whether she was a worthy bride, I think, for this prince, to see whether she was a real princess. So the fact that she noticed that the bed was very uncomfortable because they put a pea underneath the bottom of the 10th mattress, so she was that sensitive, so they decided she's really a princess. She's definitely a princess. So this idea that we make ourselves more sensitive by focusing just on this I. So then the idea is that by focusing on this I, then you're very much focusing on wanting to bring all the things that are good for the I, helpful for the I, closer, and push all the things that are threatening or unpleasant away. So we're trying to control our world based on this self-centered view. And again, this world is something that we don't have a lot of control over. So again, putting ourselves in this sort of difficult situation. And as I said last week, this idea, one teacher says, you're putting yourself, there's me here and then there's the rest of the universe out there. So you're putting yourself up against the rest of the universe. So you can see how that's true when you're just thinking of I, me, mine, that you're making yourself sort of very separate from the rest of the world. Or tell me whether you agree, feel free to disagree. But that's the idea of the problems created by this overly focusing on the self. But then, as we said last week, it is obviously important to care for yourself and to look after your, physical and mental health. But the idea is that you do it in a way that you're not seeing this one itself as being the most important. So you're doing it in the sense that I'm just one of many. That's the idea. So it's not to the exclusion of others. So that's, I think that's maybe a more subtle example of a misconception, this idea of self-centered view. And then possibly more subtle below that is something like the grasping at permanence. Yeah, I'm not sure. Tell me what you think, whether that's more subtle or not. Seems to be a bit more hidden. And then, so the idea is that you sort of keep going down with your investigation into your mind and identifying increasingly subtle levels of misconception. So another one is, which I think we touched on in that meditation, is the grasping at partlessness or unitary. So I think, for example, with your body, let's say someone insults you and says, "My God, you're really ugly." And you feel this sort of sense of, how dare you say that about my body? And you have this feeling of the body being a unitary object, in that moment. Or another example might be pride. You think, I'm so fabulous. God's gift. And you feel pride that they're sort of unitary. This is something to investigate, I think, in meditation, this feeling of of partlessness. Also, objects we're strongly attached to, I think we tend to think of them as unitary, like that that beautiful car. It's just this kind of blob of fabulousness, unitary, monolithic. We forget that it's made up of all these parts. And so that's also grasping at unitary. And then even more subtle misconception is the grasping at independence. So we tend to think of, or we forget that things are arising in dependence upon many other things. So again, in the example of, I think with attachment, maybe also with anger, you think of someone who you're angry with, and you tend to forget that their anger, that state that they're in, or that whatever they're doing to you that to make you angry, so maybe they're saying harsh words to you, they're behaving badly. So we tend to forget about all the causes and conditions which have led up to them being in that state. So things like, what else is going on in their life, various other problems that they're having, they might have health problems or emotional problems, they might, financial problems. And then, so we forget about all that and we just focus on how they're appearing to us as this sort of offensive, unpleasant person who's upsetting me, who's making me feel upset, who's frustrating me. So this is the idea of grasping at independence. So through analysis, it's useful to think about how things arise through many causes and conditions. So when we think of an object like a person, actually what they are is just the latest moment in a very long chain of causes and effects. So you think of all the causes and conditions which led to their body, for example, being in that moment, from right back to the point of conception, where they were conceived in the womb, and their body grew through many causes and conditions up to this present state, present form that you're looking at. And the same with their mind is a long stream of thoughts and feelings that trace back moment by moment right back to the point of conception, and if you believe in reincarnation, back before that to previous lives. So the idea here is that by meditating on what's called dependent arising, the fact that these things are all arising from causes and conditions, it breaks down this view of them being independent. So often we think of someone who's harming us as being like they've just they're choosing to be harmful to me. That's like their purpose in that moment. I feel like you're just trying to make me angry, you're just trying to hurt me, as though that's sort of like their autonomous purpose is to harm you. But actually, when we analyse, we see that state, that annoying state that they're in, or their harmful state, is actually the latest moment in a long series of causes and conditions which led to that. So that's the idea of dependent arising. And then there's more subtle analysis. You can go further about dependent arising, how the object depends on its parts, for example. And then also, more subtle is that object depends on the imputation. So the way it's appearing to your mind is dependent on the way your mind is imputing or projecting onto that. So, so when we think about impermanence, the way things appear to us is also impermanent. So someone who appears very nice one day can appear very not nice the next day. So we can see that the way things appear is also constantly changing. Also with possessions, you might covet some beautiful thing, clothes, furniture, houses, cars, whatever, food, holiday, and then that thing changes. So firstly, when you get it, it's beautiful and shiny and exciting, and then over time it changes, the way it appears to your mind changes, so that's also impermanent. So that's quite a lot. Quite a lot of concepts there. I don't want to bombard you too much with ideas, but I just think it's very useful to get this idea that there is these misconceptions going on, and that there's sort of layers, that they're increasingly sort of subtle. So someone raised the objection. So if you have these basic fundamental misconceptions, instead of trying to remove the more obvious ones, why don't you just go straight for the subtle one, the subtlest, because all they're arising all dependent upon each other. So you go straight to the root of the cause, which is a good point. But the problem we find is that we have trouble sort of even being aware of these subtle misconceptions. So, a good example is with grasping at permanence. So it's something that maybe we haven't noticed before. It's something that we need to focus on to even notice that we're grasping at permanence. And something like grasping at independence is sort of more subtle. So the idea is that you make your mind, by developing your mind to become more, particularly with like concentration, so you have this ability to focus on more subtle objects of mind, like independence and dependence, and are more able to analyze them. So when our minds don't have that sort of concentration ability, it's hard for us to even be aware of these misconceptions, let alone analysing them and trying to overcome them. So the process of meditation is then of making your mind increasingly more subtle and, what's the word? Like to develop this sort of laser-like concentration so that you can analyse these more subtle aspects of the mind. So the process is defined in Buddhist terms as firstly, morality. So morality is the practice of basically non-harming. So engaging in like avoiding killing, stealing and sexual misconduct, for example, is the three moralities of the body, and then anger, attachment and ignorance, or of the mind, and then of speech is like lying, slander, harsh words and gossip or unrelated speech. So anyway, the idea is by avoiding these kind of actions which tend to be harmful to ourselves and others, that your mind becomes more pacified and more calm, and then you're able to develop concentration, which is the next step. So morality, concentration, and then by developing concentration, then you can develop wisdom, so you're able to analyze these more subtle objects. So the point is that it's a process, so we need to develop the sort of capacity to investigate these more subtle things to get to the root. But at the same time, it's useful to study them, even if we can't necessarily put these more advanced analysis into practice. It's good to understand them, at least theoretically. Okay, so that's probably enough from me, I think. I don't want to talk your ears off. So any questions or comments or objections? Or yes? Yeah.
I'm not really sure how to articulate this properly, but when we speak of impermanence, when we were doing the meditation, I was actually looking for things that could potentially be permanent.
Yep.
And one of the thoughts that came to my mind is samsara itself.
Right.
So the secret for a whole death and rebirth. And I might get this wrong because I'm still learning about this. But the whole goal for, to my understanding, what Tibetan Buddhism is all about is to not just enlighten ourselves, but enlighten all sentient beings.
Yep.
So if, when that goal is achieved, what happens to samsara? Does it cease to exist?
Yeah.
Can you get that question?
Yeah, good question. I think that's one of the questions that the Buddha didn't answer. What happens when everyone gets enlightened? And so I'm not sure what the Buddhist answer to that is. One teacher I asked that, and he said, "Oh well, then it'll just be a big party," and We don't even need to. And another teacher I asked that, he said, "Oh, well, that's like an extreme kind of hypothetical." So in the debate courtyard, if someone brought that up as a hypothetical, they say, "Oh, that's an extreme hypothetical." So I guess I think that's sort of an open question in Buddhism. You would say that whether samsara ends or not. But then the question: does that mean it's permanent? So I think the Buddhist answer would be that even though something can last. It can be endless. So another example is the mental continuum. Your mind is said to be beginningless from a Buddhist point of view, but it doesn't mean permanent. So I guess it's like a river. You could have a river that flows for 1,000 years or more, the Nile, Amazon, but they're not permanent. They're changing from moment to moment. So it's sort of like, that would be an analogy of something like that. I think that's the idea. Yeah. So can you see how meditation on impermanence might be helpful? Particularly for overcoming attachment? Do you think you grasp at permanence? Can you think of any examples of where you want things to last? Yeah. Yeah. So do you think that's an example of grasping at permanence? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. Like sometimes when things are going really well, people say they get nervous because this can't last. It's making me nervous. Or other people say when something's really great and they want to hang on to it, but the hanging on to it sort of creates a problem. Like stops them from enjoying it. So then, the idea of trying to live in the moment where you're enjoying each moment without trying to hang on to it or make it last, just accept that it's impermanent. You can see how that would be a more peaceful way to be, can't you? Where you just accept that things are going to change and you expect them to change, so you're not surprised when they do change and you're not trying to force them to stay still. An example comes to mind of parents that don't want their children to grow up because they love having them around. You see that? I can see that in myself. Or when children are little and they're like 2 and 3 year olds, it's so cute, and then they go to school and become a bit sort of obnoxious and learn these sort of more obnoxious habits, and you sort of think, oh, what happened to that really cute little person? You sort of miss that innocent, sweet person, 3-year-old. So, but much better just to accept, that that's how it's going to be. People constantly changing. And also, with death, so we're all going to die. One Buddhist teacher likes to say, he looks around the room and says, how many people are going to be here and are you going to be here in 50 years? I pick out one young person, you might be here. 100 years? So 100 years probably none of us will be here. So it's good to also familiarise our mind with mortality and aging, the fact of aging. So that's the idea, by becoming familiar with the reality of our situation, that it becomes less painful when things change. So the practice of meditation is a process of realitizing, making your mind more realistic and letting go of unrealistic expectations. I think a lot of problems we have in our life is from unrealistic expectations, don't you think? Okay. So, that's about it from me. I hope I've been able to, communicate this idea of these misconceptions and deceptive appearances and how they're causing us problems, and how we can, merely by identifying them, being aware of them, is a powerful way of reducing their impact on our mind. Just being aware how your mind is being misled, and also being aware of how that misconception is causing a problem for you, is, I think, just being aware of that is very powerful, I think, for reducing its effect, negative effect on your mind. And then if you can go further and start to correct that misconception and see the more correct view, for example, impermanence, how that would start to resolve some of those afflictive emotions that arise, like attachment, for example. So that's the idea. So I think this is very interesting and quite exciting, or not exciting, not the word, like encouraging, because it makes you feel like there's actually a lot you can do about your state of mind through this analytical process. Things that are bothering on your mind, you don't have to just put up with them. You can actually do something about them by understanding them and understanding why they arise. So I think that's very encouraging. And anyone can do this. It's just a process of introspection, analysis, investigating what's going on. You don't have to be a Buddhist to do this. Anyone can do it. And it's just a matter of, more realistic way of thinking, understanding. So someone was saying last week that they often feel despondent because they're trying to be like perfect and getting disappointed with themselves or frustrated. So I think this is a common problem with people trying to practice meditation. And I think we have to really let go of any idea of trying to be perfect. So even though the goal in Buddhism is to try to become like a Buddha, I think we sort of need to forget about any idea of trying to be perfect. And we're much better to put your effort into accepting who you are, what you are. Like understanding and accepting who you are would be a much better thing to focus on, rather than trying to be perfect. And that'll just make, lead to frustration and disappointment. And you're probably much nicer and happier if you just accept who you are, rather than trying to, impose some kind of ideal, trying to be good all the time, smiling all the time at people when you actually don't feel like smiling, or, So much better to be, accepting of, how you are and what you are, rather than beating yourself up about not meeting your ideals, your idealistic view of how you think you should be, which is a common problem, I think, for all of us. It's a major challenge, I think, to accept our shortcomings, or what we consider to be our shortcomings. Okay, thanks very much. No final questions before we finish? Thoughts? Questions? So thank you for listening, and please come and listen to Cynthia next week on patience. Another announcement, this tanka I mentioned, this 3-story high Tara tanka at the Melbourne Town Hall on the 3rd of May. Entry is free. That's all. Thank you.